So the work we're doing and that we've talked about in our press release is actually a follow-on from some previous work. So we've previously looked at enforcement by local authorities because our concern is that local authorities say they need more powers, and in some cases they may be right, and then they say that landlords are no good in their area, but if they have the powers, they need to use them. And we found in our previous work that quite a lot of local authorities weren't using their powers, and so it has proved again. So we followed up that previous piece of work, and we've again found that a huge number of local authorities are simply not prosecuting landlords. Now, many of them have said before, and no doubt say again, that that's because they do informal enforcement action first, but I still can't believe that all of their informal action is so effective that in a substantial number of parts of the country, not a single landlord is worthy of prosecution. I'm quite sure that they are. And that's not to say that there are bad landlords, they're a very small minority, but we must rub out this small minority because they give good landlords a bad name. And they are effectively a tax on good landlords because bad landlords are operating cheaply, for free effectively, by dodging regulation, and that's no good. What we also did this time though, which was different, is the new civil penalty regime has come into force, which allows local authorities to take direct action without going to court and fine individual landlords and letting agents up to £30,000. So we looked at how many local authorities had used those civil penalty powers, but what we also looked at is how much of the money they'd actually collected. And we're finding that even though a relatively small number of local authorities are civil penaltying, so not enough of them are using those new powers that they asked for, but even worse, those that are using them are in many cases not collecting the money, at which point there's no point. If we sentence lots of people to prison but never actually put them in prison, we'd be entirely wasting our time. And fining people with civil penalties and then not collecting the money, you might as well not do it at all. And of course that also means that local authorities who are saying they haven't got any money, and which again is to some extent true, one of the reasons the civil penalty powers were created was to allow local authorities to retain the money from their civil penalties. But if they don't collect the money, then they haven't got the money, and you're back to square one again. So the whole point of this research was to follow this up and to look again and see whether local authorities had improved after it was done before. And it transpires that they haven't, and they need to do a lot more, and there needs to be more local political will and more effective enforcement at a local level. Otherwise, there is simply no point in giving new powers to local authorities. And as we come up, of course, to the tenant fees bill in the coming year, if we go around banning tenant fees, and I'm not going to comment on whether that's a good or bad thing, that's not really the point here, but if we ban tenant fees but don't actually enforce it, what will end up happening, of course, is a lot of bad agents and essentially criminal agents will go around charging fees, and good agents won't. And good landlords who go to good agents will end up paying more money to those agents because they're no longer charging tenant fees. And the bad agents will carry on doing it, and no one will stop them. And again, you have an unfair system where, in fact, you're almost better off to be a criminal, and you're actually encouraging people to be criminals because there's no comeback. Of course, it's easy for me to say local authorities need more political will, but they do need the money to get things started, and that's why we've said several times to government that we think the government should offer some kind of solid integrated seed funding mechanism to local authorities where they provide a fixed level of funding for, say, 3 or 4 years to allow local authorities to set up schemes, obviously on seeing a plan to show that the local authority is going to do it, but they allow them some seed funding to set up these schemes and then allow them to be self-sustaining going forward. But unfortunately, the government's very not keen to do that, and what they are doing, of course, is giving out odd little random gobbets of money that are left over. And that's a bit like funding enforcement by finding a fiver down the back of the sofa. I think we need something a bit more solid and integrated. Yeah, so one of the interesting things that's come out of all of our research is that actually landlord licensing is in many ways counterproductive. So the research we've done shows that local authorities that have blanket licensing schemes prosecute fewer people and issue less enforcement notices under the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. So completely counterintuitive, and certainly not what we expected to find. We rather assumed that licensing would lead to more enforcement. In practice, it appears in many cases licensing leads to less enforcement. And what enforcement there is tends to be prosecuting people for not having licenses rather than actually addressing the issue. The issue is not whether or not landlords have licenses. The issue is whether or not property is of a good standard. And local authorities should be addressing that issue, not manufacturing licensing schemes and then spending all of their effort running around trying to make sure people have got licenses. That absolutely makes no sense as a structure. So we don't think that local authorities should adopt blanket licensing schemes, that we think they should adopt targeted licensing schemes. But what we object to even more is local authorities who adopt licensing schemes but then don't actually address the real issues which they highlighted in order to get the scheme in the first place. So if there are management problems or problems with property standards, then if licensing is the best way of dealing with it, then licensing is the best way of dealing with it. But you must then use the licensing to actually deal with the problem, and not use licensing to deal with licensing and then just prosecute people for not having a license. That's manufacturing offences and manufacturing situations, and that's not helpful to anybody.